Every day it'll be open. Quiet audience. Inside. No better way, more authentic, more moving way.
Community organizations in Marin, Mendocino, Napa, and Sonoma counties. It's affiliated with Sonoma State University. Understanding and knowledge of the Holocaust, its impact, and its context. In the past, I've had the opportunity to introduce speakers at this lecture series. And it is my great honor and privilege to introduce the speakers. I use these phrases honestly. Neither broken nor embittered, and have fashioned lives for themselves and contributed to the community, which is a monument and a triumph to the human spirit. It is therefore with great privilege and with the greatest humility that I introduce Lucille Eichengreen. I'm sorry, Eichengreen. She was born in Germany, and she will tell herself of her deportation, the situation in her family prior to the deportation, which was in 1942. Also describe her and her family's plight during the Nazi regime. Them in the arrest of 42 SS. She came to the United States in 1946 about the Holocaust. She's author of a recently published book, From Ashes to Life, by the way. She has this here if you want to look at it. To my left, the center, and she also lectures in junior high schools and high schools about the Holocaust. Last but not least is Dr. Benko. He was born in Romania. He was deported in 1944 at age 15. He was liberated by the by the U.S. Army in 1945, and he worked for them as an interpreter in the processing center for war criminals. Dr. Benko came to the United States in 1940 Army. He received his undergraduate and graduate degrees in biochemistry from Berkeley and UC Davis. He joined the faculty of this university in 1970, and he taught courses in bacteriology, molecular biology, cell physiology, nutrition, and biology of aging. I should have favored that book. Now he's retired.
December 1st, 1939. My father was arrested 2 hours after the outbreak of the war. He was transported first to a prison in Fuhlsbüttel as an enemy alien, and a week later, after Poland lost the war, he was sent to Oranienburg in Berlin, and then to Dachau. We heard very infrequently from my father. We talked to one man who was released and fled to a Jewish cemetery outside Lodz at the edge of the former ghetto. Has between 60 and 70,000 ghetto dead in unmarked graves because we had no markers to put on those graves. I was fortunate enough after about 6 months to find work in an office. It was a cold place in winter. The snow did not melt harbor, the city of Hamburg, for the purpose of cleaning up the bomb damage and the general destruction in and around the city of Hamburg. At the Deutsche Werft, the shipyard, and other places similar to it. We again existed on very little food. It was winter, it was cold, it was raining. Most of us came down with either pneumonia, tuberculosis. Some died, and we had no contact with the population in and around the countryside. We were marched to work, we were marched back from work. We sometimes, if the distance was very far, were put into subways, again with guards and guns, and we never had occasion to speak to each other. Books to watch, and many people were suffering from either malnutrition or typhus. The British tank unit liberated the camp on April 15, 1945. They were not prepared for what they found. They did not have the medical equipment, nor did they have the food, and after liberation, 10,000 people died in this video to Germany or to Poland until 2 years ago. For 50 years, I avoided both of these countries. Please let me try to summarize the past from a distance of more than half a century. 50 years have passed since a small remnant of survivors were liberated from German concentration camps. But it is actually 62 years since 1933, when Hitler's asking then, as I'm asking now, why? But there was no rational answer, and there still is no answer. It was only after barely existing for almost 4 years in the Lodz ghetto, after seeing the chimneys at Auschwitz, that I really began to comprehend the fact that there was no hope, neither was there an escape for us. This shows Shoah, the Holocaust, cannot be compared to anything in human history. Not the Inquisition and not the pogroms. The Holocaust stands by itself. Man's inhumanity to man. A black mark in our history. So horrible, so inhuman. That nothing even remotely resembles the systematically planned and executed killings, the gassing and cremation of millions of human beings. And genocide has been industrialized. How can I explain the industrialization of such killings? The victims paid for their own destruction. Their gold teeth were used, the mountains of shaven hair were used, even skin and bones found to use. Can you comprehend what a woman looks like, her head shaven, her hair gone? I'm still touching my skull. I still recall those months without air. It seems to come to terms with the past. But those of us who survive will never be able to forget or forgive, for only the dead have the right to forgive. After an absence of more than 50 years, I returned to Germany and Poland, seeking information about the past and the present. I brought with me unanswered questions about the Holocaust, as well as hopes and expectations for the present state of Jewish culture and traditions, respect and human dignity accorded to all citizens alike, but I only found arrogance. Although the antisemitism we encountered was not as extensive or intense as that which we had experienced 50 years earlier, it still found insidious forms of expression. How is it possible that some people can actually question the Holocaust, question the extent of the anguish, disseminate from the faith?
On April the 15th, it will be 50 years since British forces liberated the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I was one of the survivors. One would think 50 years is long enough to forget the horrors, the deprivations, and the dehumanizations that were inflicted upon us. One forgets lots of details what happened 50 years ago. Yet, so much horror is remembered. I was born and lived until the age of 14 in the small farming village of Sterfritz in Germany. The village had 1,200 residents, out of which were about 100 Jewish people. Gentiles had lived harmoniously together in this little town for over 300 years. We lived a comfortable life until Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. Early on in that year, the Nazi brown shirts were sent to our little town to agitate the population. Public school teachers, although they had been friends of the Jewish families, became vicious anti-Semites. We, the Jewish children, had to sit in the classrooms and listen as the teachers preached that Jews are the root of all the evil that had befallen Germany, and that they must be done away with. We were in the most hateful anti-Semitic songs like Köpfe rollen, Juden heulen, translated into heads are rolling, Jews are howling. Children are easily misled, and they constantly harassed and physically assaulted us. In sewing class, the teacher instigated the girls to stick needles into my body. One teacher, a Mr. Whiting, hung Jewish youngsters by their feet on trees and let them dangle there for the amusement of the others. On another occasion, this same teacher took these children to the public swimming pool and dumped them into the deep end of the water. When they were finally pulled out of the pool, they were barely alive. My brother was one of those youngsters. Having been subjected to constant stress and aggravation, my father died of a heart attack in May 1935 at the age of 49. Between the years of 1935 and 40, many Jews were able to emigrate from Germany. I have often been asked, why did my family remain there? First of all, we did not have the financial means to purchase passage to South America, Shanghai, or any other safe haven. Moreover, the United States immigration quota system. Numbers were issued to potential immigrants whose relatives in the United States could fulfill the needed financial guarantees for them to enter the United States. We did have relatives in America who were willing and able to help one of us get to these shores. My mother decided to let me go first so that I could later possibly help the rest of the family. All necessary papers, including paid shipboard passage to the United States, from my relatives in the United States, were sent to the American consulate in Stuttgart, Germany. My quota number was called, and in early 1940, I went to the American consulate in Stuttgart. I passed the physical examination, and I were later forcefully transported to Estonia. There, my mother and sister were killed, and I survived 6 labor camps and 2 concentration camps. I will never forget November the 9th, 1938, the Kristallnacht, known as the Night of the Broken Glass. Synagogues were destroyed on recognition. November the 9th, 1938, was thus the beginning of the systematic annihilation of the Jews in Germany. September the 24th, 1942, will always be vivid in my mind. That day, my mother, sister, myself, and hundreds of others were deported from Frankfurt, Germany. SS men, strutting and cursing, shoved us into railroad cars. As we were herded into the train, an unconscious woman with horrible red welts around her neck was brought on a stretcher and loaded onto the train. She had hung herself, but her heart was still beating faintly when the Nazis came to pick her up in her class, watching it all. On that horrible journey into the unknown, I sat squeezed onto a seat next to a young nursing mother. Her infant was whimpering incessantly until he could whimper no more. Since we had had no food and hardly any water for days, this mother could not feed her child, and he, with 3 men, were selected to stay alive for the time being to do hard physical labor. My mother and sister were torn away from me to be killed. We later learned that the peculiar-looking windowless buses they were shoved into were mobile gas chambers. Thus, my mother, my sister, my 100-pound bags of lime and cement to the work site, all in preparation for our next job. Lime is a very caustic substance, and since we did not have the necessary protective clothing to carry those torn bags, in 1944, it became apparent that the Germans were losing the war in Russia. Once again, we had to be moved, this time back to Germany. The still fairly healthy women from the various camps in Estonia were brought to the outskirts of Kale. There, we spent 3 weeks on an open field without any shelter until a boat for us, the Baltic Sea, became available to us. During this time, the ones unable to continue doing slave labor were slaughtered. Finally, we were herded into a boat, standing room only. It took 3 days to cross the Baltic. It was 3 days without water and only 1 of bread per day. It was 3 days without any sanitation facilities. We finally arrived in the concentration camp of Stuttgart, Germany. Weak, tired, and dirty, we had to stand roll call for endless hours. Whoever fainted was revived by being doused with a bucket of cold water. The following day, we had to tow onto a train and arrived days later in a labor camp called Neuengamme, which was not far from Hamburg, Germany. After about 7 months in Neuengamme, air raid sirens were heard many times a day. We could hear the reverberating gun battles close by, and we knew if we could hang on just a little while longer, we would be able to survive hell. But once again, the Germans had to torture us some more. This time, they transported us to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The last few miles to the camp we had to walk, and whoever
entries that can happen overnight. The influence of the rise of the Nazis in Germany marked itself all over the Balkans in the sense that the newspapers were bought up. So the press that we got beginning in 1938 changed radically. Suddenly the press that really was a free press. There were competing papers. I come from a town of 100,000 people, which 20,000 were Jews. And there were 5 newspapers. There were only 2 or 3 sheets. I was one of those bad people, eventually. And I was arrested when I was 11 for a short while. I immediately discovered what civil rights were, and that if your identity card does not say Jewish on it, then you had civil rights. But if it was stamped Jewish, that meant you had no civil rights. Everybody carried identity cards, by the way, as soon as the Hungarians took over from age 7 on up. And we became gradually separated from the life of the city. In my home country, but it existed all over Europe. In Paris, in one night, 5,000 children were deported because they weren't born in France. Children. So, I'm trying to give you an overview of the spirit of the times as well as my personal story. So you'll see that the mentality of exclusion, the mentality of separating people from others was a theme I was on gymnastics would play. I mean, same kids that used to come to my house and stay overnight would never have anything to do with me. You know, the experiments that's embarked when others have repeated here, they really work. All you have to do is make a group different, and they are treated differently. In this step-by-step process, the Jewish community was separated from the rest of the community by denying jobs, by denying ability to earn a living, by denying common services. Jews couldn't go to the hospital, couldn't go to the public hospital, so there's a Jewish hospital in my hometown. They built that in the 20s, but it was the same way with schools. Schools had a numerous clauses, which means that they tolerated only 3 or 6% Jews, depending upon the school. And I wound up going to a Catholic gymnasium in my hometown as one of 3 Jews among 600 students, and everybody knew who we were because on Saturdays we wore yellow armbands. Well, at first there was only evidence, but later on the distance got further and further and further, and there were constant fights and bitterness and virtually constant fighting every day that I went through. But this time in 1943, the Hungarians decided to enforce the laws which they had passed. Now, you've probably all heard about the Nuremberg laws. Nuremberg laws were anti-Jewish laws that passed. Tried to be better Nazis. The Hungarian Nazis tried to be better Nazis than the German Nazis, and therefore their laws were more stringent than the Nuremberg laws to prove their worth. And so consequently, people who were even, quote, less Jewish, 1/32 or 1/64 Jewish, were also regarded as Jews. Jews couldn't own land, first they started with not being able to teach, not being able to practice any licensed profession, being able to be an apprentice, not being able to hold a job, not being able to own, and so on. So gradually, the Jewish community shrank on itself, and the Jewish community literally maintained itself from its own resources. My father was in a tax court, and he used to come home with tears in his eyes because the tax court could only assess people, but it had no power to collect. So they would say, you owe so much money. And they sometimes were confiscating, they're asking people to contribute half their income. So that, and this is before going to the concentration camp. This is before the really bad things happened. So in this spirit, of course, the curfew came, and the curfew literally was a stranglehold on the Jewish community, and it affected one part more than the other. The curfew means that you cannot leave your house till 7 o'clock in the morning, and you have to be back in the house by 7 o'clock in the evening. And that meant that all the ordinary transactions, such as food, are impossible because the store is open at 6. And if you show up by 7 o'clock, everything is gone. The food rations that were distributed in the Axis powers were jokes. It one of the monumental frauds of the world. In the United States, you're used to that. If you got food rations, there was food for those rations. For those rations tickets. That was a joke in Europe. It wasn't true in the First World War. It wasn't true in the Second World War. It only meant that you had a piece of paper on the ration. Was simply not true. So essentially, in order for Jews to survive, they had to participate in the black market. Now, knowledge of the existence of the black market is a capital offense. And people caught with black market goods at times are shot on the spot as an example. There is no trial, there's in essence martial law. Now, the other thing is that a person carrying a Jewish identification card is regarded as a non-person because a policeman can kill him without accountability. I was arrested and the policeman didn't have to tell anybody because I was a Jew. Now, if I had not been a Jew, then a policeman would have had to fill out papers and state where I was and so forth. But as a Jew, you had no rights whatsoever. And so the entire Jewish community now had to acquire its daily food by subterfuge. One of the ways of doing this is to buy extra rationally, arrested less frequently than adults. And so a lot of the teenagers and younger teenagers who look more like children bore the brunt of this. We used to run around and get material together, and there was the pervasive fear that we would be arrested, and if we were arrested, we knew we would be tortured, and the fear was to denounce your loved one. Everybody who existed had committed a felony. Everybody had 2 pounds of sugar in your house. That was against the law. If you had coffee in your house more than a couple of teaspoons, that was against the law. If you had any stockpiled food, that was against the law. My father was very wise. He bought cigarettes and was a non-smoker. And the peasants sold a lot of goods for cigarettes where the currency was of no worth. But storing cigarettes themselves wasn't, 2 or 3 people, ration tickets and so on. It's not unusual that they become informers. But that the informers would inform on those whom they've known for a long time, I still find shocking to this day. I remember days when people that we knew came to our house and they asked us for the books in our library and for the furniture, saying that an area about half the size of a football field. And this only has sheds that are open on 4 sides, and 20,000 Jews were concentrated in that area. 1 bathroom, 1 closet. There were people dying. There were doctors there. Their supplies were exhausted. And the other thing they told us is that we could only take with us what we could carry in our hands. And I remember to this day my grandmother, who was 75 and a very tiny lady, or anything, as such, but we were distributing water in hats because we had no pots. We were making tools out of old tin cans. Luckily, there were some ex-jailbirds among us, people who had been in jail before. And it's amazing what people in jail learn to do. Because they told us how to make knives and how to make spoons out of things we would have never thought of making knives and spoons out of. Hungarian concentration camp. We actually stopped in the city of Budapest, the beautiful city, I'm told. I've only seen it from the window of a boxcar, and then we were taken out actually to the house of detention in Budapest, and you've all heard about that had not eaten for 3 days of food, and they baked their own bread. And at considerable risk to themselves, they went up to the fence and they threw loaves of bread to us without asking for anything. It was unheard of. And we couldn't even thank them. I mean, we bowed and we smiled and waved to them, but we didn't speak any language. We found out later from the guards that they were Serbians. Well, we were shortly deported from here to Birkenau. You've heard about it's subcamp of Auschwitz, and in recently published maps, we were in the famous gypsy camp. That's where most Jews from Hungary have wound up. Well, it's called the gypsy camp because the gypsies had been there, and by that time there were no survivors. And the camp at any one time held 30,000 people. The selection process that you've heard about, the selection process is as described. The obvious that things were going downhill. Our food consisted of something dark, a dark liquid in the morning, at breakfast, at lunch, something like a dried vegetable soup. I worked as a food technologist some years ago, and just as an amusement, I took a look at what the Germans considered food standards. And it's amusing because it was so muddy that you could see the chambers, and there were such things as crematoria. But we had no idea about the level of brutality that happened. And the beginning prisoners, or prisoners just in a camp like this, they begin to withdraw from food. And interestingly enough, the old prisoners who were not very kind and not very pleasant would go force the new prisoners to eat. And we thought they were the most brutal people we had ever met. And they were trying to save our lives. Because the sooner we got used to eating that food, the more likely it was that you survived. Birkenau was a camp which was in transit. It is really intended for extermination. Some people are selected and sent on to work. Feeds the nearby chemical plants that use up people like waste at an incredible rate. By the way, it is quite questionable whether those plants' production ever justified the effort. The surprising thing is that all this effort was done to abuse and kill people, and not much came of it. Not much. So we went through the selection process, and so we learned the tricks of survival a good deal from the previous prisoners. When I arrived in Birkenau, for example, I saw people walking around, putting on their hats and taking them off in such a ritual manner that I thought I was in an insane asylum. The reason they do it is that there's a roll call twice a day, morning and night, a prisoner count, and because the people who were tall enough could reach out the windows and capture the snowflakes in their hat, and that was our water ration, essentially. We were, of course, crowded boxcars, just as you've probably read about and seen before. And there are always people who do not survive the trip immediately because there isn't enough oxygen to survive, and others who are so weakened by disease. The rampant and typhus took its toll. Typhus kills fast. Tuberculosis takes a little longer. For virtually everybody who is exposed. We arrived in a camp in work camp in Bavaria, and ironically, the work camp was in a town called Kale, which is not far from a town called Landsberg. Landsberg is the prison it happened, German civilians came and offered us water and bread. And we didn't take it because we thought it was poison. So finally, some volunteered to taste the bread and wait for a while and sip the water. And then we took the bread and the water. And that was the first time that the German civilians ever recognized that we were human beings. They marched us to the bank of the river. So we put them on the ground and we huddled next to each other to keep each other warm. We woke up in the morning, it was still pitch dark, so it must have been something like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And prisoners learn never to move very rapidly because trigger fingers are very anxious. And we carefully moved, and we went closer and closer to where the machine guns were, and to the enemy, and that's a military stratagem that everybody uses. But they were very generous. They kept throwing food at. I mean, the highways in Bavaria were literally littered with K rations and C rations and all sorts of stuff that soldiers were throwing away. And we looked at it, and luckily we didn't eat much of it because we ran into a medical detachment. This was a black medical detachment. We stopped. Originally, we had been a group of 800 or 900 people, but as soon as we were separate, as soon as we ran free, we were in clumps of 6, 7 people. Some prisoners didn't run away. They were afraid to run away. They felt the guards would come back and they would punish them. Those of us who could move, we said, what else can happen? When you're 16 years old, you don't worry about as many things as when you're a little older. So as I said, the head of this medical detachment was a physician, and I was walking bent over, and I asked him for a drug called Pruntisol. Pruntisol is the European name for sulfa drugs, and if you ask most physicians in the U.S. don't know the name, only those who trained years ago, so we probably remember the name, but he did. He did, and he told me, he said, well, we call it sulfa drugs here, and he advised me on exactly how to take it, how much to take it. Sulfa drugs can be very toxic if you don't drink a lot of water. And then he took all the food rations added around and showed us what to eat. Most army food is poisoned to former inmates. That's why so many died at the end of the war, because their systems cannot handle rich food, and all the army has is virtually rich food. But luckily, they had powdered milk and powdered eggs and crackers and cereal, which are things that we could eat, and cautioned us not to overeat, to even force ourselves not to overeat. We literally used to help each other, less from eating. I mean, can you imagine somebody go out and gives you a bar of chocolate after you haven't even seen one in 4 years? Very hard to resist it. But we managed it, and we did survive. And one of the other things that this officer did, which I'll never forget, he gave me his blanket. Later on, I discovered that the Army is very democratic in only one way. Issues 2 blankets to generals or admirals and officers and soldiers. You get 2 blankets when you go to war. You're responsible for those who don't turn them back. You pay for it. And they gave us their blanket. He gave me his blanket, and each one of his men gave a blanket. Now, the officer could not have ordered the men to give his blankets. They gave it of their own free will. So shortly after we left them, there was a snowstorm. This is May 1st, 1945. And there's snowstorms in Bavaria. The snowdrifts were taller than I was. I fell in one of my friends pulled me in, and I was lost. And the snowdrifts are so high. And he saved our lives because we huddled together and covered ourselves with a blanket that they had given us, good little army blankets. So that was the liberation. I'll say
Thank you very much, all three of you. We have time for some questions. Please indicate who you're addressing the question to and speak loudly so that the whole room can hear you, and then I won't have to spend time repeating the question. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah, okay. The question is, what...
Times
This large ghetto had factories which provided the Germans with any kind of consumer goods. Uniforms, corsets for the ladies, hats for the men, you name it, we produced it. In return, we got frozen potatoes. We touched them and it was a fermented mash. We couldn't eat it. We had no meat. We saw no meat whatsoever, which had a large percentage of sawdust. We had turnips, lots of turnips, but most of the time frozen, not fresh. And food was rather in short supply. That's an understatement. And whatever they gave us, the pigs wouldn't touch. And we got to a stage where we would eat and cook and wash potato in desperation. So food was non-existent.
in prison in Estonia, food was given through this little hole in the window. And some mornings, they gave us fish eyes. No matter how hungry we were, we didn't touch those fish eyes.
Did they try to make you eat food that was...
We ate whatever we could eat, whether you were religious or non-religious, because this was a matter of survival. There were girls with us that had been religious, that had kept a kosher place, but they had to eat. You either ate or you were dead.
What factors do you attribute the psychological ability to cope? Some people other people, but strength, what inner strength did you build among yourselves to?
I agree.
Certainly the friendships. I certainly agree. Although I don't have any friends from the camps. I don't know anybody that I was in the camp with. It came so early that we were disrupted, and I don't know where the others went. The one other mechanism that helped was prisoners, except Jews, could get food packages in concentration camps. Jews were not allowed. So the Danish prisoners received these food packages, and they were magnificent packages in their size and the variety. They sat down and they opened up the packages and they shared them just like this do. They knew the consequences of their act. And like they hid those packages and they guarded those packages. They knew they could extend their lives that way. But they...
Was it difficult to have the opportunity to work with the Allied government versus prosecute SS officers?
Not for me.
I mean, was there a rush on off? Was there a lot of people who wanted the job?
Oh, yeah.
Or they just recruit you out of nowhere?
No, they selected people who translate. There are not many people who spoke English fluently, and I was one of them. So I spoke some other languages they could use, so it was on a selection basis.
And that was your situation too, was it not?
I also worked for the British Red Cross.
Say that again, I'm not sure.
I also worked for the British Red Cross shortly after liberation in Bergen-Belsen. As soon as we were able to, were cleaned up and could walk again, the British soldiers and the Red Cross came and asked if there were any people that could speak some English and could help in the clothing sheds to clothe all these people again.
I don't believe so. I have come across people who were very devout, very clear answer, Mr. Watt.
There really isn't an answer. When they come,
Good. Some of these were relatives of mine. The only survivors in my family are in the United States. And I shared some, but I couldn't share a great deal. Part of the reason that survivors often sought each other out because they could speak in a code that they understood, while others could not. And many survivors could not speak for a long, long time. Many.
the trains running, there were no buses running. The British Army had the K ration, but the K rations were practically assured death because our stomachs weren't used to this food. There was no medication. It was strictly chaos. And whoever survived the first few weeks just couldn't make it. But a lot of people couldn't make it through those first few weeks. They were too weak. They should have been fed by bottle or by other things, but not K rations. They couldn't take it. 28,000 people died in Bergen-Belsen after liberation.
The first night, we did not get K rations. That came a little bit later. The first night, we got the pound can of pork and fat. We opened the cans, most of us, and started eating them. And by morning, a great memory of it.
Well, when I was liberated, I was not in a camp. And so we came on an abandoned railroad cars that were intended for the Army. And we found cans, but we didn't have can openers. So we tried smashing the cans and open, but we couldn't get very far because we weren't very strong. We didn't have any tools. So we couldn't get at the food. So we wound up in a town called Mittenwald. For those of you who visit Austria, this is a very beautiful town. All kinds of frescoes on the wall. The townspeople had heard that there were prisoners coming, and they opened up the town gymnasium, and they brought some food there, and there were loaves of bread and pieces of this and that, that they were trying to make food. Obviously, they were very scared. They thought we were going to sack the town. Now, there is nothing more absurd than that notion because we barely walk. You know, there are 800 people who would be blown over by a strong wind, but they did provide some food. And then in the nearby town, in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, there was an abandoned army post just outside town, and within a week they had set up displaced person team, and they did have the rations. So the Americans army has a habit that whenever they move from point A to point B, the first thing they do is bring a kitchen, and then they cook, and then the rest of the people arrive. And what the others did not eat, we got. And that was plenty. And so within a week, we were getting food not properly served, but there were many, many people who were in camp who did not. And there were, you have to remember that half of these people were dying. They were infected with infectious diseases. If this would happen today, no soldier would cross across. Who would enter? The soldiers wouldn't be allowed to enter because they'd be so afraid of spreading the disease among themselves. And we were lousy with kids looked like us. We were not very attractive people. But in my encounters in that time, they didn't draw the line. They brought as much food. The American Army's unofficial ways of providing food are so institutionalized that nobody does it regular. Anyhow, the units are broken up, and they hand out the food. The problem was, though, that the food was rich. And no one had been trained, no one had been warned about the situation. there were tremendous problems. There were repatriations. There were forced repatriations to the Eastern Front, and they were mass suicides. People who fought in the German army on the Ukrainian side from there, and they were called war criminals, and therefore, according to the accords signed by all the Allies, they were regarded as war criminals. They were reported as they were mass suicides.
I can't personally begin to identify with the hurts and wounds that people like you must be carrying for your life. But I was wondering if there are enough to trigger a lot of the things that, for example, can you even face a turnip?
There are smells that cause memory triggering. There are smells and there are situations that are there are sounds that do trigger memory. Yeah. In the railroad cars, tracks, certain sounds will trigger memories in us. But I also should say that in us, you see only a fraction of the population. There's a population that still can't talk about it. There's a population that can hardly function. There's a population that never functioned. We're lucky in the sense that we do.
Took me years.
It's very efficient. They won't run away, but they can't run. So the personal relationships are there's no gain because there is nothing to be gained